You find yourself in an underground parking space, not sure how you got there or what you're doing there. But the next thing you know is the sound of a terrifying screech in the distance. You quickly conclude that it's some kind of monster, and you run into the opposite direction as fast as you can. But for some reason, in the worst of all moments, your legs don't function the way they're supposed to. The monster is making its way to you much faster than you're able to get away from it. It gets closer and closer, until you finally panic and wake up. You're now sitting in your bed, quickly realizing that what you just experienced was a nightmare. You are now no longer dreaming. Instead, you're present in the actual world. Except, how do you really know this? The only reason you now know that you are dreaming is because you suddenly remembered what it's like being awake. When you're in a dream, it feels real. You don't remember that you went to bed last night and entered some kind of dream world doing so. Only once you remember what the real world is supposed to look and feel like, which usually happens once you wake up, it becomes easy to see why your dream was indeed a dream. Another way of looking at this is to say that we all have a default state of experience, namely being awake. And we can compare this to this other state of experience, namely dreaming. And we understand that we enter this second state of experience usually once we go to sleep. But let's imagine for a moment a hypothetical world. One in which you have been asleep and dreaming for your entire life. And let's also imagine that in this dream, you are just as thoughtful and rational as you would be when you're awake. Now, since you have been dreaming for your whole entire life, this dream experience is the only experience that you have any knowledge of. There is no other state of experience that you know of, and thus no other state of experience to compare your current experience to. So, even as a perfectly intelligent and reasonable person, how could you ever find out, in this situation, that you are in fact dreaming? What experiment could you run that would show that you're in a dream world rather than in the actual world? Is there anything you can do to test whether the world around you is a product of your own mind or a real external world? And remember, from your perspective, this is the only kind of experience that you have ever seen. There is no other experience to compare yours to. It seems like the answer to this question is no. For the person stuck in their permanent dream, there is nothing they can do to test whether or not they are stuck in a permanent dream or not. And we can now point this question to ourselves. What can we do to test whether we are living in an imaginary world rather than the real one? The most popular depiction of this idea in modern times is surely by the science fiction film we all know and love, The Matrix. The world that the people in The Matrix experience as real is a mere computer simulation built by robots. That is not exactly the same as a dream, but it's still very much analogous. The idea that The Matrix is built on is known as the brain in a vat hypothesis. Almost exactly like in The Matrix, the brain in a vat hypothesis posits that we could be a brain in a vat, detached of any kind of physical body, instead linked to a supercomputer that provides our brain with all the experiences and all the proper responses to the brain's outputs to make it think that it's living in the real world. Both the dream idea and the brain in a vat idea posit the same question. If all of our experiences can be illusions, is there anything in the world that we can say for sure exists? The brain in a vat hypothesis is actually a modern version of an old thought experiment by French philosopher René Descartes, a greatly important figure in Western philosophy. He imagined a situation in which there is an evil demon with the goal of deceiving Descartes by presenting him with a complete illusion of the outside world. In this scenario, Descartes would have every reason to think that the earth, the sky, his hands, his eyes, and all of his senses are real external things. And yet, they're not. This led Descartes to realize that all things about the external world can be reasonably doubted. That other people exist can be doubted. Even that your own body exists can be doubted. However, what Descartes also realized is that even if you doubt all of these things, the one thing you cannot doubt is the existence of your own mind. This realization of his led to one of the most well-known quotes in the history of Western philosophy. Je pense, donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. How he arrives at this, however, we will get to in a second. First, I want to talk about how it is this idea that greatly contributed to the rise of rationalism. The view that the primary method of discovering truth is by logical reasoning, rather than by measuring and observing things in the outside world. To show you what I'm talking about, let me give you an example of logical reasoning. To be able to say that all bachelors are unmarried, we don't have to go out and investigate every single bachelor to see whether or not they are married. To be a bachelor literally means to be a person who is not married. So because of this, we simply know that a married bachelor cannot exist. Because as soon as somebody is married, they are no longer bachelors, by definition. This type of knowledge, the type of knowledge where we can know things based on logical reasoning alone, is known as a priori knowledge. This is Latin for knowledge from before, or knowledge from earlier. You can know that all bachelors are unmarried before investigating all bachelors. You simply know this a priori. So now back to Descartes. It is exactly by employing this kind of reasoning that Descartes comes to his conclusion, that one cannot doubt their own existence. Because for you to doubt your own existence, there needs to be somebody doing the doubting. Doubting cannot occur without a doubter. So doubting that you yourself, as a thinking mind, exists doesn't make any logical sense. Who is doing the doubting? Note that Descartes doesn't mean that you exist with your current body and brain. All of that can be regarded as part of the external world. What he means is that you exist as a mind, or you as a person. Whether you're a brain in a vat, the target of an evil demon's deceptions, or some non-human being stuck in an everlasting dream. In all these cases, one thing is certain. There is a you that exists. So does this mean that we should all accept that nothing exists outside of ourselves? Solipsism is the view that all we have just talked about has been hinting at. It is the view that the only thing we can know for sure exists is ourselves, and everything else is unknown at best. So should we all be solipsists? Well, that depends what exact variety of solipsism we are talking about. I think it's fair to divide solipsism into two main varieties. Let's call them absolute solipsism and agnostic solipsism. An absolute solipsist would make the claim that indeed, nothing outside of one's own mind exists. Whereas the agnostic solipsists would merely say that we don't know whether anything else than our own minds exists. The former makes a claim about what's going on, whereas the latter doesn't make any claim. By the way, just to make clear, agnostic is a term that is normally used when speaking about the existence of God. To be an agnostic means to concede that you have no idea whether God exists or not. An agnostic doesn't affirm nor deny God's existence. Nowadays, though, this term is used more broadly, and so it can also refer to other topics outside of the existence of God, just like I'm doing right here. So rather than applying it to the question of whether God exists or not, we can apply it to the question of whether solipsism is true or not. I hope that makes sense. So, should we all be absolute solipsists? Well, the quick answer to this question is almost certainly no. Asserting that nothing exists outside of ourselves is almost definitely a step too far. This is because we have no way to verify whether or not the outside world is real or not, and this goes both ways. We cannot verify that the world is real, but we also cannot verify that it's not real. So, should we all commit to agnostic solipsism then? Well, maybe. This is where it gets more interesting. But in order to answer this, let's first go over a concept known as the burden of proof. Anyone who makes a claim has a burden of proof. To have a burden of proof means that it is up to you to prove that something is the case. Let's take a look at an example to show you what I mean. Let's say that you and I come across a jar of marbles. I claim that the number of marbles in the jar is an even number. As far as you know, I have no way to know whether or not the number is even or odd. It's not my jar, I didn't place it there, I didn't count the marbles nor have anything to do with them as far as you can tell. So I have claimed that the number of marbles is even, without giving any evidence for this claim. You now have three ways to respond to this. You could either agree with me and join me in claiming that the number of marbles is indeed even. You can also disagree with me and claim that the number of marbles is odd rather than even. Do you see the problem with both of these options? They both make a positive claim about the number of marbles, even though there is no evidence to support either claim. There is nothing that tells us that it's even, and there is nothing that tells us that it's odd. So the only way to avoid holding a position that makes you claim something that you cannot prove is by remaining agnostic about the number of marbles. In response to me claiming that the number of marbles is even, you could say that you don't agree with me because you don't have sufficient evidence to conclude that they are, nor that they are not. So by disagreeing with me, this doesn't mean that you are agreeing with the opposite view. You don't agree that there is an even number, and you also don't agree that there is an odd number. You're completely neutral. This is always the default position when facing any question. And in this case, without opening the jar and counting the marbles, the most rational position for you to hold is this agnostic one. The best answer you can give when somebody asks you what the number of marbles is, I don't know. It seems that with the question of whether or not the external world is real, we are in a very similar situation. With the marbles, there are only two possibilities. Either the number is even, or it is odd. And it seems that in our case with solipsism, the same is true. Either the external world is real, or it is not. What may be a difference here though is that with the marble analogy, it's very clear that we have no evidence for the number being even, nor have any evidence for the number being odd. Both possibilities are equally likely or unlikely. This might be more muddy in the case of solipsism. Arguments for which one of these options is more likely can be made. For example, you could say that a real external world has more explanatory power than an illusory world. You could say that it seems that everything we observe is more to be expected on a real external world that functions outside of ourselves than it would be in an illusory world. Maybe this is a good argument, but the objection I would give here is how would we even measure what is expected in an illusory world? I'm not sure how we can make any predictions about this. On the other hand, those in favor of solipsism could make an argument based on Occam's razor. This posits that the most simple explanation is usually the correct one, or at the very least the most reasonable one to hold. And since solipsism only requires one mind, instead of billions of minds and a huge number of material and energy to function, it could be said that solipsism is a more simple explanation of reality. And thus, according to Occam's razor, it's the more likely one. But here too my objection would be, how do we even measure simplicity? Even on solipsism, some very advanced system must still exist to produce the illusions that make us think we are living in a real external world. It's not really obvious to me that a system like this would be more simple than a real external world. When it comes to proving whether or not the external world really exists, it seems that we are forever stuck in a position of not knowing. And not just when it comes to proving, but I would say even when it comes to just showing which one is more likely. I don't think we really have any solid ground to even start investigating this. So when it comes to actual knowledge, I don't think that we're ever gonna get that much closer to an actual answer. And yet, at the same time, it seems so obvious to us that the external world is real, even keeping in mind all the problems we just discussed. Despite this problem, it seems almost psychologically impossible to really believe that the world around you doesn't exist. And I think that this brings us to an interesting irony. As we just discussed, the state of affairs in which we find ourselves are such that it is impossible to distinguish between a real world and an illusory world. And on the one hand, it's easy to imagine that this realization could fill us with existential dread. But on the other hand, since there is absolutely nothing that points to one option being true, whereas the other is false, this also means that even as the world is completely illusory, this would be completely inconsequential. It would change nothing about your life at all. So, as terrifying as solipsism may sound, this may actually be, ironically, one of the least terrifying ideas you can think of. It has such little impact that, even if true, we would never discover it. Think about this. Whether the jar we came across earlier has an even or an odd number of marbles inside of it literally would have more of an impact on your life than solipsism would have if true. In conclusion, I would say that solipsism is a fascinating idea to think about. To realize that the nature of everything you know may just as well be completely different from how you always perceived it to be certainly is an eye-opener. And while the answer to the question of solipsism ultimately would have no consequences for us, the same is not true for other questions, in which we can be way too quick to rely on our perception of things. Coming to understand the problem of solipsism serves as a great reminder of the fallibility of our perception and intuition, and why evidence and reason should always be favored if we're interested in discovering truth.